right, well, hello everyone, and welcome to our next installment of Q&A with PNJ. I am Melissa Ziobro, the Specialist Professor of Public History at Monmouth University in West Long Branch, and a member of Preservation New Jersey's Education Committee. And I'm here today with Dr. Richard Veit, the Interim Dean of the Wayne D. McMurray School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Monmouth University. We'll be talking a bit about preserving historic cemeteries, but more on Dr. Veit and the cemeteries in just a moment. First, some technicalities. I apologize if you are a faithful viewer of Q&A with PNJ and you keep hearing me say this over and over again. If you've not attended the past sessions, though, I urge you to go check them out on Preservation New Jersey's YouTube page. So, the technicalities I mentioned. Q&A with PNJ is a project of Preservation New Jersey that seeks to highlight voices across New Jersey's historic preservation community and bring their knowledge and expertise on a wide variety of historic preservation topics to the public.
Okay, close your eyes.
We just ask everyone to please go ahead
Go
and
relax.
That would be great. Thank you. The Q&A with PNJ is initially taking place online and runs approximately 1 hour. The session usually starts with a quick networking round where we have everybody introduce themselves. However, today, because we have 78 people registered, I am going to invite everyone to introduce themselves in the chat if you are so inclined. Now, again, for those of you that have been here before, we usually have a true question and answer format, hence the title, right? Q&A with PNJ. But today we're going to have Dr. Veit speak for roughly 30 to 40 minutes. Then we'll open it up to questions from the public. Okay, so one last thing, just for everyone's awareness, this session is being recorded so that it can join the other sessions on Preservation New Jersey's YouTube page. Okay, whew. Now that those formalities are out of the way, just a little bit more about our wonderful speaker, Dr. Veit. Richard Veit is Professor of Anthropology and Interim Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Monmouth University. He received his BA from Drew University, his MA in Historical Archaeology from the College of William and Mary, and his PhD in Anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania. He has authored or co-authored numerous articles and reviews and 5 books, including New Jersey Cemeteries and Tombstones, History in the Landscape, and The Archaeology of American Cemeteries and Grave Markers. So we could not have anyone better suited to be making this presentation on preserving historic cemeteries for us today. I could go on and on about Dr. Veit's CV and what an all-around great person he is, but let's hand it over to him and let him get down to business. So Rich, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Melissa. Let me pull up our presentation. And thank you all for spending some time on this somewhat dreary afternoon with us. All right, and I'm going to pull the little block of faces over to the side. So I titled this Dead Men Do Tell Tales, Interpreting and Preserving Historic Cemeteries. And our examples today are all going to be New Jersey examples. And this is based on work that my good friend and colleague, Mark Nonestide, and I have been engaged in really for probably the last 2 decades. And I start off with a picture of Mrs. Cutroneo in Oceanport, New Jersey. And she's kind of listening here to a gravestone. And there's a story behind this that I can tell you later, but I think the image speaks volumes, because if we listen to the stories cemeteries have to tell, they can be just tremendous sources of information about local history and culture. So first I'll start off with a brief history of New Jersey's cemeteries, colonial burying places up to the 20th century, and then we'll talk about some preservation issues, and then I welcome your questions. So this is one of the oldest surviving markers in the stone, and it's actually a little bit of a preservation problem. It was restored as a Boy Scout project, and it's in the St. James Boy Scout Eagle project. It's in the St. James Episcopal Cemetery in Edison, New Jersey. And it's a very large tombstone from the 1690s, and this speaks to the earliest period of European settlement in the state. It's also distinctive in that it's for two boys, Charles and Richard Hooper, who, as you'll read, were poisoned by eating mushrooms for food. And they were apparently told twice by their parents, twice told, don't eat the mushrooms. For any of you who are parents out there and have told kids not to do things multiple times, here is, the sad ending of the Hooper story. They just didn't listen. But this is, in fact, a tombstone and a great example of the very early colonial markers found in New Jersey. Some of our earliest markers in northern New Jersey have these incredible mortality images on them. And that's because northern New Jersey, think Essex, Union, to some extent Somerset, Morris counties, were settled in large part by New Englanders who brought down this Puritan tradition of gravestone carving. So here we have a skull and crossbones, a little hourglass. Remember the daytime soap opera? Like sands through the hourglass, so are the days of our lives. And then, I don't know if these are vultures or crows, but some ominous birds. And then licking the whole thing, I thought these were actually little waves, but when I took the picture, my wife said, no, they're not waves, dear, those are flames. So a pretty grim image for Miss Woodruff here, who died in her 60s. But it speaks to the Puritan mindset, where it was thought that only a select number of people were going to heaven. Most people were not. By the middle of the 1700s, we see new designs coming to the fore. And these are sandstone markers carved from stone quarried in Newark or Belleville. This marker is in Westfield, New Jersey. It's got a great shape. It's an hourglass, right? It looks sort of like a Coca-Cola bottle, carved by Ebenezer Price, and it shows a cherub. Now, my good colleague and friend Adam Heinrich has argued that we see cherubs because of changing styles in art. It's a move to the Baroque style. He may be correct. Anthropologist Jim Dietz long ago argued that what we're seeing is the Great Awakening, a new religious movement where you can be saved through faith. So you would have an angel essentially on top of the stone rather than a death set. The other fun thing, and this is something to check out as you do your own cemetery safaris, Aeiouy. So imagine the carver saying to his apprentice in 1760, little Jonathan, give me those vowels one more time. They still don't look right. And Jonathan practices down here in an area that should have been covered by grass. Different parts of the state have different styles. So this marker is a little bit harder to read, but it's in Bergen County, New Jersey, and it's in Dutch. It's for Abraham Ackerman, who died in 1791, a simple field stone. In northwestern New Jersey, if we get into Warren and Sussex counties, we get German language markers. This marker, I would love to read you the whole thing, but we really don't have time, but it's for a fellow who came to America in the 1730s. It says he got married, he had six children, and he lived in this land 71 years, 3 months and 8 days, and died at 10 o'clock in the evening. You couldn't want more information, right, if you were a genealogist. John George Windemuth is the fellow. He's in Stillwater. Over here, these simple marble slabs are actually really characteristic of Moravian cemeteries. And the Moravians felt that all people are equal in the eyes of God, so you don't need a big fancy stone. Mr. Windemuth was not a Moravian. He didn't feel that way. In coastal New Jersey, so think Monmouth County, parts of Middlesex County, we see New England imports, slate gravestones that are often very well preserved. Slate is not badly affected by acid rain or by the shaling and spalling that hurts sandstone. So this is in the Rumson Cemetery, and it's for Joyce Hance. Also, a funny little thing with the date here, it looks like she died February 4th, 172 2/3. What you should keep in mind here is in the 18th century, they're slowly moving towards our modern calendar, where we start the new year on January 1st. Their new year started, if they were using the older Julian calendar as opposed to the Gregorian calendar, their new year started in March. So if you died in February, it could be 1722 or 1723, depending on which calendar you're using. Sometimes we get awesome stories engraved on markers. So this is a Philadelphia style stone. In southern New Jersey, we get more marble markers like this one. They're badly affected by acid rain, so they're often very hard to read. But you'll notice this one has a Scottish flag and an English flag. This is in Pluckham in New Jersey, and it's for a Revolutionary War soldier, but he's a British soldier. Captain William Leslie of the 17th British Regiment, sometimes called the Tigers of Princeton, who died at the Battle of Princeton. Actually, he was badly wounded. His friend, Benjamin Rush, the most famous doctor in early America, he's like the Dr. Oz of colonial America, had young Captain Leslie taken north towards Morristown and the American hospitals, but he died on the way there, and he was buried in Pluckham, and Rush paid for his marker. So it actually speaks to how the Revolution is very much a civil war. Here's another southern New Jersey example. So sometimes a gravestone is not a stone at all. This is in the Pleasant Mills Cemetery by Batstow. Beautiful spot, well worth a trip. And Batstow is famous as an iron-making town from the 1700s and 1800s. It's in an area without a lot of natural stone. So the folks who worked in the blast furnaces actually cast and inscribed their own iron grave markers in the 18 teens. And these are two examples. There are probably 24 examples in southern New Jersey total. When you think about stones, and this is sort of the national style by the end of the 1700s, we get this very plain style that is similar to what we'd see in Philadelphia. No real decoration at the top. You have an inscription, and then at the bottom you have an epitaph. And this stone has a great inscription and an even more interesting epitaph. So Abraham Van Gilder, who's buried in Stelton, Seventh-day Baptist Cemetery in Edison, New Jersey, born on the high seas, October 1701. Imagine poor Mrs. Van Gilder, right? Giving birth on a ship. Dies February the 28th, 1818, 116 years. That's a heck of an accomplishment in a world without modern healthcare. But then down here it says he was a rebel against heaven, full years 116. And by Christ's free grace, he then became an heir of God, a newborn son. So what exactly is going on here? I don't know. I thought he might be a rebel against heaven as an atheist or an agnostic, but my students have suggested that he's a rebel because he's just not going. All his friends have passed on and he's still here ticking. In the 19th century, we moved from burying grounds and graveyards associated either with churches or communities to formal cemeteries. And Mount Pleasant in Newark is arguably the finest in the state. They often, they have corporate boards. They are laid out beautifully, beautifully landscaped, often with ornamental plantings and lakes, and they have monuments. But one of the things that sets them apart is typically a beautiful gatehouse. And Mount Pleasant is, pardon a really bad phrase, to die for. I mean, it's spectacular. So you know you've arrived when you come into Mount Pleasant. Inside these cemeteries, again, beautiful landscape. And the idea is to get away from the crowded, cluttered, unsightly, unhygienic graveyards of the 18th century. We start to see three-dimensional monuments, such as this Richter monument in Camden County. It's beautifully carved. New designs like obelisks, which don't really speak to Christian settlements, but to ancient Egyptian religion, right? This is a ray of the sun, sort of turned to stone. This is apparently the largest obelisk in the state, and it's in Neptune, New Jersey, in Greenwood Cemetery. And Mr. Bennett apparently made, I was going to say a small fortune, but he made a pretty substantial fortune with vaudeville houses and put up this obelisk. One of the things to think about with Victorians is we often think of them as very like prim and proper, but they had a sense of humor just like you and I. And here we are in Gloucester County in a Victorian cemetery with a nice overstuffed granite chair. And I hate to say it, but it's actually more comfortable than some of the furniture in my house. So those humorous Victorians. And we love new technology here in 2020. Folks love new technology in the 19th century too. So this is a gravestone that's not a stone at all. It's a monumental bronze marker. These were cast by a company in Bridgeport, Connecticut, sold by traveling salesmen, and had to be a terrible job. And they were billed as lasting forever, cheaper than stone, and beautiful. This one's in Long Branch. It was actually erected by sort of the Women's Auxiliary of the Grand Army of the Republic for deceased soldiers of the vicinity. And it's from the 1870s, and it's in fabulous shape. So some of that advertising was accurate. The other thing we see at the end of the 19th century is sort of the rise of American capitalism. And my good colleague, Professor Ziobro, teaches about this. So we have these titans of industry, right? So this is an evergreen cemetery in Newark, and this is the Kruger family mausoleum. So if you have consumed beer from a can, you have the Kruger Corporation to thank for that. And they did very well with that invention. So imagine being like the successful school principal, a lawyer who's done well for himself. And then the Krugers come along, and there goes the neighborhood, right? They put up this enormous mausoleum. Some sad aspects of the state's history are also reflected in our cemeteries. New Jersey is although a northern state, there are enslaved people here up until the Emancipation Proclamation, and prejudice obviously continues long after that. This is a marker for an enslaved individual in Woodbridge's Presbyterian Cemetery. Jack, you know, a colored man who belonged to, right, a phrase we might find offensive today, to Jonathan Freeman. He was a faithful servant, died in 1825. And one wonders, is Jack being commemorated here? Is Jonathan Freeman being commemorated here? But it speaks to an important period in our state's history. Service in the military provides African Americans from New Jersey and really across the country with the opportunity to have inexpensive government-produced but attractive markers for their graves. And this is William Powell, who served in the 9th U.S. Cavalry during the Indian Wars, so a Buffalo soldier, and he's buried in the White Ridge Cemetery in Eatontown. This is, I think, a Mr. Richards as well in the same cemetery, and I just love the portrait, right? Here's this dapper gentleman, right, in his bowler, looking good. Our state is a small state, but it's incredibly diverse, and it's one of the things that's wonderful about it. So this is the Roosevelt Cemetery, a largely Jewish cemetery in western Monmouth County, and we see Jacob Landau, the famous artist, right here with some other members of his family and his circle. So Jewish cemeteries. 19th century, huge waves of immigration, German immigrants, Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants. This is in Newark, New Jersey, but here you see kind of Newark in microcosm, an Irish grave marker, an Italian grave marker, and a German grave marker. And this is like a blacksmith's tour de force, right? So real folk art. This is an Italian marker in the same cemetery. This is the famous cemetery you would pass through as you drive north on the Parkway, heading, let's say, from Monmouth University to Seton Hall for a basketball game. And here you see Andrea Massi, a musician, an Italian immigrant. Many Italian immigrants came over with really limited resources, but did well here. And here you see him with his trumpet. He is ready to perform. New Jersey has, a little known fact, the National Ukrainian Cathedral in Southbound Brook. You got to go visit. It looks like a rocket ship taking off. It's a fabulous piece of architecture. And some of the markers there, like this life-size bronze Cossack, are just fantastic. You come around to Boxwood and you see this guy, it's terrifying. We also have a Gypsy or Romani population. So here we have Big G and Lovable Rose. Big G has passed on. Lovable Rose is still with us. And the Romani or Gypsy people, this is Evergreen Cemetery in Hillside, New Jersey. In fact, King of the Gypsies, the movie, was filmed there. They're very competitive with their markers. We have a growing Muslim population. So this is up by Patterson in a Muslim cemetery. Beautiful plantings, but instead of a Bible, we see the Quran and the word peace on it. Folk art abounds in New Jersey's cemeteries. Gordon Bond and Stephanie Hoagland have done some wonderful research on it. Here is a concrete and bathroom tile marker So, you know, you could make one of these yourself. This one's in a Polish cemetery in Linden. And on the back, it actually says Frank Blasco Builder, Linden, NJ. And then it gives like his 4-digit phone number. So you could call him up and say, Frank, that's fabulous. I've got some bathroom tile. Can you make me a marker? We have ceramic grave markers. Middlesex County and Mercer County were really sort of central to America's ceramics industry in the 19th century. And these are in Perth Amboy for a Danish immigrant over here and for an English immigrant from Lambeth. And Lambeth is a huge potting center in Great Britain. They're terracotta. Occupations are depicted in cemeteries. Here is Abram Philhauer, who died during World War I, depicted in his uniform. Incredible carving on granite. We have famous people. Aaron Burr, Vice President of the United States, and not Alexander Hamilton's best friend, is buried in Princeton. And he's much easier to go see than Hamilton on Broadway. We have forgotten people. This is a prison cemetery in Hamilton Township, where folks just have numbers on little concrete markers. It's actually quite sad. And there are some just fabulous pieces of art. So in Rosedale, Rose Hill Cemetery in Linden, we've got the Ray C. Memorial, a granite Mercedes-Benz, life-size. It's just fantastic. Ray was promised a car by his parents when he was old enough to drive, passed away very young, but they got him the car. And it will last. It's granite. It will be here as long as the pyramids. There's humor. Here's Sal Giardino. So I have bad news for you. If you need an electrician, well, the self-proclaimed world's greatest electrician, complete with license number, has passed away. He's even got an outlet. I mean, this is a guy with a sense of humor. William Hahn, you know, Princeton has a lot of smart people. William Hahn is there, and he's witty. I told you I was sick. Yeah, he wasn't fooling. But in honesty, even though cemeteries can be funny, they can be informative, they can be full of beautiful art, they're also historic resources, and sometimes they're very much endangered. And that's kind of the second half of the presentation. So here we are just outside Newark in a Jewish cemetery, and you can see the level of vandalism that has occurred here. Probably 1 in 4 stones knocked over. Pretty horrific. On the other hand, here we are in Coltsneck, kind of a Tony suburb here in Monmouth County, completely overgrown historic cemetery. Though I should tell you, my good friend Frank Rizzuto, who is mayor of Coltsneck, assures me that this cemetery has been beautifully restored. So this is an older photo. So if you are faced with a cemetery study, what are some things you might do? Well, first thing to do is documentation, right? Before you do anything, before changing anything, figure out what you're dealing with. Research the history of the site. Record the current condition of the stones in the burial ground. Identify the materials being used, because that's going to affect conservation measures. Identify the types of designs. If you can, the carvers. Put together a map. That is easier and easier to do with GPS technology. You may want to commission a conditions assessment report. This is a sort of thing where a professional comes in and tells you what is going on in the cemetery and what needs to be done. And then come up with a list of priorities. Often with larger cemeteries, you can't do everything. So what would have the greatest effect? And think about sort of short-term and longer-term goals. So then just to walk through some of this. So here's a marker. The face is shaled off. You can't read it. It's broken. But you would still want to document its presence, right? It marks a burial of at least one person. So document what's there and its condition. If possible, identify the material. So these are some common New Jersey materials. Sandstone in the northern part of the state, especially in the 18th century. This is carved by the Osborne shop in either Woodbridge or Scotch Plains. Marble, here's the John Stout marker. Granite tends not to erode. And there are other materials, but these are 3 of the more common. If you can identify the iconography, the style of the carving, or the carvers, often you can find a carver's signature in sort of the bottom right-hand corner of the stone. So here we have Stevens in Newark. This is actually an unknown carver. I believe this photo was taken in the Orange Presbyterian Cemetery. And I like to call this carver the Roman haircut carver because this sort of combed forward look is very popular on classical Roman images. He's active in Morris and Essex counties in New Jersey in the 1790 to 1810. One thing to be really aware of is that what we're seeing when we look at a gravestone is it's really like the tip of an iceberg. In that often there is as much stone below ground as there is above ground. And that's because when stones were set, and this is a picture from a project that Hunter Research, a leading CRM firm did, cultural resource management firm did, often when stones were set, there is no foundation. So they're set directly into the ground and they have to be pretty deep so that they don't really get tossed over by frost action. And in this case, you can see the carver has actually signed his whole name at the bottom. But Hunter Research did not know that when they started excavating here. They only discovered it later. Here's some more practice carving. The previous slide and this one were both taken in Elizabeth's Presbyterian Cemetery, which has seen a wonderful restoration. And you have an almost complete alphabet. Again, practice carving by an apprentice. It's interesting to look at and to document previous repairs. So here we see Walter Greeken, who died in 1842. The stone must have snapped at the base, and a blacksmith prepared these really nice supports. They're kind of artistic, and they've survived probably since the mid-19th century. It's also interesting, right? This is a broken gravestone, and what does the gravestone depict? Here is, right, a sickle or a scythe, and here is a column breaking in half. Mapping is important. This is Westfield's Presbyterian Cemetery or Presbyterian Churchyard in a map drawn first in the 1970s. My colleague Mark Nonestad and I did a conditions assessment of this cemetery before it was restored. And we found that this map was actually, it was excellent. It was really, really well put together. And you could see that the rows of stones, they're kind of snake all over the place. We can employ new technologies to better understand historic burial grounds. And this is another project that Mark worked on. And this is in Monumental Cemetery in South River, New Jersey. And the fellow you see in the center of the image is Tim Horsley, and he is an expert. He's perhaps the leading expert in the United States right now in ground penetrating radar. He's a young Englishman. He's incredibly talented and using radar and other subsurface techniques that don't involve digging. He can get really interesting pictures of what's going on. So in this case, in South River, the thought was that this essentially open area of the cemetery had been used for mass graves during the 1919 influenza pandemic. When Tim ran his radar and his magnetometer and his electrical resistivity machinery across the ground, he was able to get wonderful images showing those graves. Another thing we'd want to document would be displaced markers. So this is, if I recall correctly, in Tuckerton, New Jersey, and a number of stones here broken off and they've been piled together. It's good that they've been kept, but this isn't really great in terms of conservation of those stones. And we've also lost the association, right? Because we're looking at, a half dozen stones here. There's only one person or two people buried here. Lawnmowers are such a mixed blessing. Obviously, we need them to help keep cemeteries looking good, and maintenance is critically important. If you're in a triage situation and you can't afford to restore anything, I worked on a cemetery in Plainfield, Evergreen Cemetery, that was in very bad shape. And I have to say, when we started mowing and trimmed back the shrubs, the overall appearance of the cemetery was markedly improved. This is an early 20th century lawnmower. But here's what could happen if a lawnmower is like a little bit misguided, right? We're scraping, and eventually we're going to snap off this stone for poor Sarah Scudder. Tree maintenance is also very important. Better to trim a tree before it gets too big than to lose stones to it. In this case, the tree is swallowing the stone. Or even worse, in Elizabeth, they had several large trees fall and smash quite a large number of grave markers. One thing that folks can do is almost like a volunteer project is some cleaning of stones. And you want to do this in a very careful, measured way. You never want to use anything harsh, no harsh detergents, no bleach, certainly no wire brushes. But if you have soft bristle brushes, and there's a product on the market that's called D2 that removes biological growth, in this case, lichen. So you spray it on with a spray bottle like a mister, and then you come back with a soft bristle brush, like a toothbrush, and you can clean up the stone. This is in Succasunna, New Jersey. Here's the stone before and after a little demonstration that I was doing there. Now, of course, if you don't come back regularly, the tree is still in the shade and that lichen will ultimately grow back, but it improves it. When moving grave markers, bear in mind that you're dealing with things that weigh from several hundred pounds to, in some cases, several tons. This is my only non-New Jersey photograph. This is in Newport, Rhode Island, and an attempt to set a stone, reset a stone. And I don't know how well it worked out. It looks like these three guys over here are really struggling with the weight that they're moving. So you might want to use appropriate tools. In this case, in the city of New Brunswick, a large number of markers had been displaced and put in a single pile. As part of a restoration project, my colleagues and I sorted through those stones, trying to identify them and put them back on the graves that they had come from. And in this case, we're using, power machinery and straps, both to make sure we don't damage the stones and make sure we don't hurt the people working on this project. Past restoration, there are other things we could do in terms of bringing cemeteries back to life. So in this case, a walking tour with a brochure with information about some of the individuals. And here we read about John Lawson, who was a Congressional Medal of Honor winner who was buried at Mount Peace Cemetery in Lawnside, New Jersey. These brochures could take many different forms, right? From a trifold brochure that may be available on site to something that you could have online and print out, to a whole walking tour that one could download on a phone, to QR codes that are on little markers next to gravestones. So as you walk through the cemetery, you could get more information. So many different models here. And I wouldn't say any one is perfect. They all have their strengths and their challenges. Again, with that theme of cemeteries being very much for the living, here we see Mount Laurel Cemetery in Philadelphia, a photo my friend Mark Nonestein took of the Grave Diggers Ball. So PNJ has an annual appeal many museums and cultural institutions do, where they try and raise money for worthwhile causes. Mount Laurel Cemetery, one of the great American cemeteries, one of the first American cemeteries, also has an annual appeal, and they do a ball in the cemetery at Halloween in order to raise money for restoration activities. And it's, as you can see, very well attended. Cemetery tours can be really enlivened by having individuals play the part, or the parts rather, of people who are buried in the cemetery. Here you see John Zielinski, and John is the living expert on the cherubs of northeastern New Jersey. He did an incredible amount of research on them for his thesis. Here he is portraying a gravestone carver, and he's created his own little cemetery here, which is just amazing, in a tour of a cemetery in Old Bridge, New Jersey. So here he is again, and I would say, right, cemeteries are very much for the living, and it's important for us to see them that way as resources for communities today that could be shared through walking tours, preservation workshops. While many preservation issues must be dealt with by professional conservators, there are issues that interested friends groups can certainly take on. We can create virtual tours and even virtual cemeteries. Friends groups have been very effective, especially with major Victorian cemeteries. So some of the things you might think about as ways to help study cemeteries. And then finally, there are some national organizations that are really worth participating in. The most famous and the largest of them is the Association for Gravestone Studies. They have an annual conference, which they sometimes call Cemetery Camp. Monmouth University's hosted it twice, and they tour cemeteries, they teach preservation techniques. If you're into cemeteries, this was made for you. And they publish a scholarly journal and a newsletter, and they've got all sorts of swag too. So if this is your thing, here's the organization you've been missing. So that's a brief overview of New Jersey's historic cemeteries and some ideas about preservation and cemetery conservation. And be happy to open it up for any questions that you might have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rich. If you'd like to unmute yourself to ask Rich a question, you can certainly do that. If you're more comfortable typing your question in the chat, I'd be happy to read it out loud for you. So please go ahead. I can start with a question while everyone locates their unmute button.
Oh wait, we've got some are appearing here, Melissa.
Oh, there we go. What's the story of the woman listening to the headstone?
Oh, that's a great story. So that's the Cutroneo marker, right? It's in Oceanport, carved by a Monmouth County carving firm. So Mrs. Cutroneo was the mom, the protective mom of several boys. He used to like to go out in the evening and get themselves in trouble, and she would stay up late waiting to hear their car on the gravel driveway next to the house. And when they came home and she heard the tires crunching on the gravel, she knew that they were safe and she could go to bed. So when she passed away, her sons commissioned this monument. Her sister posed, and they used a photo to recreate her likeness. And I have this story from the fellow who carved the monument. So it's probably pretty true.
Very interesting.
And I think there are a lot of questions here.
Yeah, we got a question from Bernard here. What's the estimated cost of a condition study?
I would say the estimated cost is between, depending on the size of the cemetery, probably between, so let's say it starts at probably around $5,000 and goes up from there, depending on the size of the cemetery.
Now, Rich, if folks need to find someone to do a condition study, or if they need a professional conservator, or where would they start to find?
So I think folks can certainly reach out to me for information. I can point you towards some conservators. The New Jersey Historic Preservation Office would also be a wonderful resource for conservators who've worked in cemeteries. Some cemeteries that I'm aware of that have had studies that could probably provide names would be Westfield's Presbyterian Cemetery, the Whippany Cemetery, the Long Valley Cemetery, and Elizabeth's Presbyterian Cemetery, which is very large, has had a massive conservation study. So those are some of them.
Excellent. I have a question here from William. Middle Valley Cemetery is small, 2 acres, old, 18th century, and full. The trustees are getting concerned about perpetual maintenance. What resources are available to figure out how to manage the cemetery after the current trustees' tenure here on Earth is done?
Yeah, so there are a limited number of resources. I think what we often see happening with colonial cemeteries is municipalities may may take ownership of them if the congregation or the trustees that were once associated with the cemetery are no longer able to. You want to try and plan ahead as much as possible so that there is continued maintenance over time. I know with some smaller historic cemeteries that have run out of room, that no longer can bury individuals, they have started creating areas for cremains. Christ Episcopal Cemetery in Shrewsbury, New Jersey has an area where they're burying cremains now, is one means of helping to support that cemetery.
Rich, you kindly suggested people could contact you, but is there anywhere an existing list of professionals who can repair historic markers? This one's from Tyrene.
Yeah, I don't know that that's why I was sort of opaque there. I apologize for the opaque answer. I don't know if there's a single list. I've worked on a number of projects, but there are a lot of and I'm not a conservator at all. There are a lot of great conservators out there. One that comes to mind, and he's certainly not the only one, Gary McGowan, who is in Morris County, New Jersey. He has a conservation firm and they do a lot of cemetery work. I think they worked on the historic Somerville Cemetery. So, but there are quite a few firms, yeah.
Okay, this is from Ruth. Do you know of any volunteer groups that have been successful in restoring or cleaning? I have a background in hands-on cemetery preservation and would like to connect with others in the Middlesex area.
Yeah, so Ruth, that is a great question. I would suggest reaching out to the Middlesex County Cultural and Heritage Commission and Mark Nonestide there directly, because he has been involved in a number of similar projects. And there is a New Jersey chapter of the Association for Gravestone Studies, so I could see some opportunities there. The Philadelphia area.
Just want to share, Ruth, Mark is one of our board members at PNJ and also on the education committee with us. So if you want to send, we have your email address now. We can make sure we make that connection.
Yeah, he is incredibly knowledgeable, and he's also the past president of the Association for Gravestone Studies. Are there studies? So Philadelphia, there are a number of excellent preservation firms in and around Philadelphia. The one that's jumping to mind for me is John Milner and Associates, but there are a lot. So that's just one example. Are there studies that need to be done in Morris County and beyond? I would certainly think there are. A number have been done, but there are many more. And Morris County has fabulous colonial cemeteries and Victorian cemeteries. Keystone Preservation, yeah, that's actually a very good one, Keystone Preservation Group. What is the responsibility of cemetery trustees? So that's going to vary very much depending on how the enabling legislation for that cemetery corporation was written in terms of what responsibility there is for repairs to monuments damaged by trees. So in some cemeteries, it may fall on the cemetery board. In others, the responsibility may lie more with descendants. But that's often very problematic, right? Because we live in a highly mobile society. So we often aren't living in the same communities where our direct ancestors live.
Rich, I think we've gone through most of the questions here. Do you have any that came directly to you as opposed to everyone in the chat?
No, I'm just seeing the group ones. I didn't.
Okay. Here's Heather asking, have you done much work with Staten Island?
So this is going to be like such a New Jersey centric, terrible answer, right? But as a New Jerseyan, I have imperialist ambitions for us to take over Staten Island because I think it fits so well with New Jersey geographically and historically. For our Association for Gravestone Studies tours, we always try to get out to to Staten Island. So there are wonderful colonial markers. Ebenezer Price, who's Elizabethtown, New Jersey's best colonial carver, or most prolific. Best is, you know, I shouldn't call one the best. You love all your children, right? But he is all over Staten Island. Great markers. St. Andrew's Cemetery and in Richmond Town is fabulous. The Vanderbilt family mausoleum is, it's off the charts. It's just so cool. So Staten Island is, you know, it's worth the toll to cross the Outer Bridge crossing and go spend some time. Really wonderful cemeteries. I haven't done any restoration work there. Mount Amwell Project, David Redding, author and historian. Yes, that's a great project. So thank you for putting that out there. Great cemeteries out there in Hunterdon County. I've done a lot of visiting of cemeteries in Cape May. I haven't done any restoration work, but Cold Spring, many of the cemeteries, and there's great stuff in Cape May, right? Because you have cool Victorian markers, you have nice colonial markers, there are some iron markers, there are New York City markers from the 1700s. It's pretty cool stuff. And then protections, if any, exist. So protections are frankly really limited for historic cemeteries once they no longer have like a family group that's maintaining them or a corporation like a cemetery that is maintaining them. There is a New Jersey Cemetery Board, but its primary concern is with active cemeteries. So once a cemetery ceases to be active, burials are no longer occurring there, the cemetery board has really limited influence. And there has been legislation that has never fully made it through our state legislature to try and protect historic cemeteries. There was a tragic, really a tragic story that occurred a few years back in Middletown, New Jersey, where a family cemetery from the 18th century with some wonderful markers, very well preserved in the middle of a condominium community that had followed the farm that was once there, was partially demolished through a terrible error. Members of the condominium board did not realize that they did not, in fact, own the cemetery, that an active family descendant group retained ownership of the cemetery and had been maintaining it. A member of the condominium board found the cemetery unsightly and hired a company to come in and remove the stones. They started quite literally smashing the stones, and a young lady went home and told her father, who had taken her out to see the cemetery, like, oh, they're smashing the gravestones. He called the police. The police came out and said, like, what are you doing? Stopped the project right there. And it was really embarrassing because, again, the condominium association it was kind of like the hole in the donut. They did not own this land. It was not theirs. It'd be like knocking down your neighbor's house without telling them. There was an attempt to have legislation to protect historic cemeteries because of that. There's also a national movement on that the Society for Historical Archaeology is very involved in to try and protect African American cemeteries, which are very much at risk, historic African American cemeteries, because often they have sort of limited traces above ground. One of the things you should realize, particularly when you're in a cemetery from, say, the 18th century, is that you're seeing like the tip of the iceberg. Descriptions of the Quaker burying ground or the Friends burying ground in Shrewsbury, New Jersey from the 1800s talk about literally several hundred wooden markers. If you go there today, there are no wooden markers. There are a couple dozen stone markers. So, and wooden markers would have been quite common, but they have a limited lifespan. So again, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Excellent. Well, I'm glad that Livingston is taking care of the Eli family burial ground. I think I've driven by it. Connecticut, yeah, has much better legislation in terms of cemeteries, and they could provide, I think, a model. Traditional tuck pointing. Hold on, I'm going to go to this link here. It's a new phrase for me. What is tuck pointing?
Oh, wow. Someone taught Rich something new today.
This
Look
is
at
excellent. tuck pointing. All right, so I have to be frank, I haven't been looking for tuck pointing, but I'm going to start. So I don't know that I've seen tuck pointing, but you know, there is an English thing that you see in Jamaica and India and in Great Britain that you don't see too much here, and that is the lettering on marble markers. You'll see like little lead letters put in there, and that's very common in the UK and in former British colonies. Again, I've seen it in both India and in Jamaica. You almost never see it here. So something else to look for. I mean, there are all sorts of cool things. You can really get lost in the cemetery. I know that sounds silly, but there's a lot to look for. Wow, okay, so the AME Cemetery in Allentown, 170 burials when only 62 were marked. So you know, for the sake of complete honesty, I botched up my presentation in that I showed you, Tim, I was really trying to stay within a time limit, so I cut a lot of images out. I showed you Tim Horsley doing radar in South River. And what I didn't show you is his map, which is mind-boggling because where they thought there would be mass graves from the flu pandemic of 1919, they found hundreds of graves packed in there, none of which have markers. Now, without excavating, we can't say for sure that they're from the influenza pandemic, but a very good circumstantial case can be made that they were. Yeah, ground penetrating radar is very useful, very, very useful. This is fun. Anybody else have comments, questions?
We have
Favorite cemeteries worth visiting?
one or two last questions, and then our wonderful PNJ director, Emily Mans, has a couple comments she'd like to make. So anything else? Okay, Emily.
All right, there we go.
Say a few words. Thank you again so much, Rich. That was wonderful, incredibly informative. And I'm sure you're going to have people reaching out to you after the fact now to pick your brain.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So
Well,
this is
such a pleasure. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rich. So I'm sure people will have questions that they'll want to follow up. This is Dr. Richard Veit's email address just pulled from the website. So you can reach him there. Next up on PNJ, Q&A with PNJ, we have 3 more for 2020. So if you're just joining, if this is your first one or you've been with us for all 6, you still have more chances to join. We have on November 12th, actually a past president of PNJ, John Hatch. We're talking about racism and preservation efforts in Trenton, which will be really interesting. Melissa, our facilitator for today, an incredible Q&A PNJ moderator, will be doing a session on oral histories and how to get started in creating oral histories for your organization or other projects. And then we will have our final one for 2020 will be with Dr. Doris Carpenter, who is one of the advocates for saving Camden High School, and she'll talk about gathering energy and activism for preservation efforts in December. So that will be it for the year. We have such a great turnout today. I wanted to just make sure we did a plug for what PNJ is and all the different programs we run. We have memberships, of course. We do educational programming like this, which is relatively new. This started in July, kind of a response to the pandemic, and to make sure that we kept providing educational content. We do our 10 most list, which people might be familiar with, and we also have the Preservation Perspective newsletter and the other items here you can see on the screen, like the 18th Sanctuary. And please feel free to connect with us. You have Rich's contact information now. You can see info at Preservation NJ, that goes to me and Dale Perry, who are both at PNJ and on this call, and follow us on social. So this is our best attended ever Q&A with PNJ. So it was exciting to have everyone on, and just thank you to Melissa and thank you, Richard, and everyone here for your time and for asking such great questions. So,
okay. Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
And this is recorded, so if you missed anything, you can check it out online later. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day.
Bye.